The 2000 single quotes were a very special time, especially in terms of animated movies. A lot of my favorite movies came out during this time, but it's fascinating, because the majority of animated movies we were trying to replicate the success of Shrek, whether it's animated movies with adult jokes and pop culture references, or movies that rely heavily on gross-out humor or most notably fairy tale spoofs, and there were quite a bit of these in the 2000 single quotes, and one of them was a little animated film called Hoodwinked, a movie that is so bizarre looking but interestingly compelling at the same time, and many people felt the same as it was a big box office hit despite getting destroyed by critics. And of course with a success like a $110 million intake on an $8 million budget, a sequel was inevitable. But it wasn't exactly the sequel fans were hoping for, and that's putting it lightly. It once again got obliterated by critics, but just like Fantastic Four, 2, it bombed hard at the box office and immediately became a contender as one of the worst not just animated but movies of that year, and I don't think it's that bad. Now don't get me wrong, it's not great and definitely has a lot of issues, but it also has a lot of good stuff that I think deserves recognition, so Cmon guys, Hoodwinked Too isn't that bad. So just like the first movie, it opens with Nicky Flippers played David Ogden stars narrating, eventually folds into a storybook just like the first movie, only this time it starts with a recap of said movie and then we get into the story, where the main characters are on a secret mission to save Hansel and Gretel from the witch of the cookie house just like in the fairy tale. Only Red isn't with them, and because Wolf is very incompetent, the witch ends up escaping and taking Granny with her. Then we meet up with Red. WHO is on some kind of secret organization of goodie bakers. WHO give her a test, where she has to get past the troll of the bridge with a goodie basket or she fails. Obviously she gales cause she lets her temper get the best of her, beats up the troll and ends up letting the basket fall off the bridge. Which leads to her getting a lecture from one of the head bakers in this sisterhood, as well as getting a tour of the goodie temple as well as the vault that contains the recipe for the most powerful goodie in the entire world. But unfortunately the recipe gets stolen, and Red hears that her granny is kidnapped and immediately rushes over to headquarters where she and Wolf are assigned to track the witch down and save Hansel, Gretel and Granny. Now the story itself is pretty generic. Heck, this is an overused trope just like the last two movies. But unlike those two, it adds a few elements to make it enjoyable. For one, the interesting concepts they introduce are pretty well handled, like the giant having a club that looks like a beanstalk, or the entirety of the Sisterhood of Bakers, or the Dark Castle Towers being an obvious riff on the Disney castle. And that's not all. The action scenes are all amazingly enthralling except for the last one, cause the bad guys basically defeat themselves, but the way they do is still pretty hilarious. As for the characters themselves, they were still the same likable characters from the first movie. Red is still the same snarky protagonist with good martial arts skills. Wolf is still the hilarious bumbling idiot. Twitchy Wake, there's a change and his speedy voice is still pretty much the same likable friend to the wolf he was in the first movie. Granny is still the same badass elder that she was in the first, except this one goes a little more into her backstory of how she became such a respected name in the goodie world. Hansel and Gretel are nowhere near as fun as Boringo the bunny from Hoodwinked 1, but they are still perfectly serviceable villains. Verushka is a very boring and forgettable character. Her motivation for kidnapping Granny is very weak though. She only wants revenge because she got beaten by Granny in a truffle cook-off. That's it, that's the only motivation for her whole plan. That's possibly the lamest motivation for a villain ever. As for characters like Kirk the Woodsman, he's barely in this film, and when he is, he's kind of annoying. I never thought I'd say this, but please get Jim Belushi back. Nicky Flippers is still the best character in the movie. While his screen time has been shortened a bit, he's still an incredibly likable presence. I'm probably one of the only people that actually like it. The animation in the first movie, it has such a bizarre yet visually distinct look to it. There was no other animated film at the time that looked like it, so I was a bit put off by the sudden change in animation for the sequel, especially since Red looks like a completely different character. But I eventually got used to it. It's safe to say this isn't first-class animation, and some things to look muddy in terms of texture, but for the most part it looks pretty good. The character animation is bouncy and energetic, and express clear emotions. Places like the mountains, the Beanstalk Club and Dark Castle Towers look incredibly colorful, and the designs of the characters mostly stay true to the look of the first film. Again, the animation is clearly not great, but it is pretty good for what it was trying to do. The soundtrack is pretty solid, The first movie has better songs and a better soundtrack overall, but this one still has pretty catchy upbeat songs. The only thing that is a big problem for this movie, as well as a lot of Weinstein's other animated movies, is the lip-syncing. Why does Weinstein always let this happen? Is it really that hard to edit your character's lip movements so that they sync up with the dialogue? Just take a few extra minutes and fix it so it looks good. Overall guys, Hoodwinked 2 is not that bad. It's not great and has a lot of problems. But I don't think it deserves the hate that it gets. The first movie is obviously better, and it's a much more enjoyable experience, but this is still a solid enough experience. This is not a movie that I watch regularly. This is nowhere among my favorite movies of all time. My opinion on this is like nostalgia critics on Spider-Man 3. It's not a favorite of mine, but it's definitely a pretty well put together little movie that has some good stuff but some bad stuff too. And I didn't talk about the bad stuff as much, because that's already been done to death. I wanted this video to be more positive. Anyways guys, what do you think of Hoodwinked 2? Let me know DKWN in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.